A winter's gale chilled the quarry workers to the bone as Bier, overseer at the time, marched along. "Heave, men, heave," he would shout. "We've quotas to fill and carts more besides." His eyes gandered at several pits to see the hard labor out of order, out of tune. He struck up a song, one filled with rowdy words that flowed like a warm drink. Soon everyone took it up in spirit, swinging only when the song let them. All joined, except Ula. Ula's mouth moved, but she sang no song. It was more out of habit than anything. Her mind lingered not on the words of the singing workers, but the tapered rod when it struck the cold stone. Frozen limestone was easy to fracture in these parts due to the rock's composition, especially with worked muscles like hers. Pause, heave, crack. Pause, heave, crack. Every swing still stung, no matter what clothes you wore to brace for the cold or how tough your body was. But it never stung quite enough for Ula. The days she worked in the quarry left her sore but whole, cold with sweat and snow, unfrozen. Still there, still swinging. And she reviled it. Pause, heave, crack. Pause, heave, crack. Pause, heave. Ula! Ula flinched, snapping her eyes away from the growing pile of chipped black rock. Some of her blonde hair escaped her unkempt braid, leaving it in front of her eyes as she rounded on Bier. "What?" she asked sharply. Bier's normally rigid features and sharp amber eyes softened. "Take a lunch, lass." Ula looked away, already raising the rod. "I'll go after everyone else." Crack! Bier grasped the rod with one hand before Ula could raise it again. "Everyone's back from lunch." Now Ula's surroundings returned to her fully. More miners funneled into the quarry. Some were already back to swinging with a song on their lips. A few lingered close by, concern crossing their eyes. Ula ripped the rod away from Bier's hand. "I'll skip it today." Knowing he was not strong enough to tear the rod from her grasp, Bier stepped in front of Ula, arms crossed. "Lass, you need to..." He stopped himself, grumbled and chewed the inside of his cheek, thinking on his next words. "Ula, take a break. Go home." Feeling her muscles relax, her bare arms grow cool with chilled sweat, Ula didn't want to leave for the day. To go back home. She also knew that Bier was as stubborn as she was. Lodging the miner's rod in the dirty slush of mud and snow and rock, she wiped her hands off the jacket tied to her waist. "Don't let anyone touch my spot." "Never do," Bier replied and stepped aside for Ula. The idle workers watched her pass, some with envy. Everyone knew of Ula, who started in the mines not 5 months ago, and yet she was the toughest miner in the quarry. Stronger than most of the men born and raised in Bielholm. The quarry was the life and blood, town and trade in the isolated slice of civilization so far north. Times were harsh in the summer, which only grew harsher once snow started to fall. Many took pause of working in the snow, preferring to wait till warmer weather comes. But those tough enough persisted through the winter, fueling the town's primary export. Climbing up and out of the pits, Ula strode toward the main part of Bielholm. Her thoughts overwhelmed her sight as she trudged through the streets filled with fur-clad bodies and wafts of bread and soup. Only when she thought about putting her coat on and sneaking back into the quarry did someone lightly grab her shoulder. Ula about ripped away until she heard who it was. Hey, it's me." It was Riel, an old friend from days of school and ice skating. Her hazelnut hair was well kept, a fine, light leather coat on her shoulders, fringes of gray fur catching light snowfall. "Haven't seen you for a while. Let's grab something to eat." "I'm actually going back to work," Ula rasped, her throat suddenly dry. But Riel stayed her hand, steering her friend toward the closest eatery. "Don't be silly. I know you're on lunch right now. Let's take a break. My treat." Ula didn't want a break, even when Riel paid for both of their meals. Not when Riel tried to reminisce about old times. Not when their stew came with a heaping slice of bread, both steaming fresh. Riel dug in and kept talking. Ula, barely hearing her friend, hardly acknowledging the food in front of her, disassociated. Jovial chatter and waiters shouting for orders were drowned out by memories of coughing. Flickering firelight warped with scenes of a man. A man reassuring her as he donned himself in the heaviest layers and a sling across his chest large enough to hold a child. Everything felt numb. Ula's mind repeating the scene over and over and over, never quite catching the words the man spoke. She herself would cough, begging him to stay. Ula snapped back when Riel placed a tentative hand on hers. "Let's just stay here for right now, alright?" Ula adjusted in her seat. Sounds came back to her in force, uncomfortably encompassing. "I'd rather just go back to work." Riel glanced down at untouched food. "Please just eat something before you do anything, even the bread. I worry for you." "Don't." Begrudgingly, Ula tore up the bread and snacked on some, silently berating herself for how good it felt to chew on something other than her own tongue. Relenting a bit, only a bit, she took a spoonful of soup, much to Riel's delight. "Don't give me that look," she told her friend. "Hard not to when I see you eating something other than... well, you don't eat much nowadays. Maybe we can grab dinner tonight? It's supposed to be lovely weather. I hear the lights might even pop up." Ula shook her head. Finished chewing, she replied, "Can't tonight. I'm going out." Riel's shoulders slumped. Fiddling around with her napkin, her mouth parted slightly, no words following. It took her a minute before she found the courage to speak. "It's been over a year, Ula." "Just barely, actually," Ula corrected. Riel shook her head. "The town already sent out search parties. We tried our best. We went out in spring and didn't find anything else." "That's why I'm trying again," Ula mumbled. The soup was bringing some warmth back in her gut. "There's a couple places we didn't check." Riel rubbed her face and temples. Ula, it's time to let go." All talking around them halted at the cracking of wood. Half a wooden spoon clattered off the table, and Ula's bowl was nearly upended by the impact she made. A small spray of salt spilled off the other end of the table. Dropping the splintered handle, Ula resorted to sipping her soup straight from the bowl, and drained it halfway before slamming it down. "I'm going back to work." Standing up, she fetched 3 copper coins from a pocket, tossed them onto the table, then left, leaving Riel solemn. Ula returned to work. Her spot remained untouched. Heaving the rod, she started jabbing in some crude tandem with a song the others were singing. The sky grew dark as afternoon turned to evening, and though the others retired, trickling away from the rock like water, Ula kept at it. Muscles screaming, blood pumping, mind focused on straining to provide more anguish. Pause, heave, crack. A whistle signaled the end of the workday. Ula got one more good jab in before calling it. Even if she wanted to keep going, Pierre would make her stop one way or another. As usual, she was the last one to leave the pit. While everyone tucked in their leathers and furs close, hurrying to huddle around hearth fires and hot meals, Ula made a straight line to her abode. It was not the same hovel she lived in a year ago. She was quick to move out of that lingering place in preference of solitude at the edges of Bielholm. The small main room was cold, and it would remain that way for a while longer. Ula moved to change her clothes quickly. She wanted to get in as much time searching as she could before fatigue inevitably weaseled its way into her bones. An extra layer of furs, snowshoes just in case, a pouch of jerky for energy, waterskin, ice pick, fire starter, hatchet, all the things she would need and more for a long night out in the wild hinterlands in case she got lost or a blizzard struck. Leaving in stride, she started for the southern path without a second thought. If anyone found her suspicious or worried about her destination into the wilderness, they didn't show it. Ula charted out a course in her mind. She wouldn't need a map or compass for a good half-hour's walk. Even then, she knew the area well enough and trusted her instincts. She did know, however, that there were always some extra hidden paths, divots, harrowing shadows of roads long past overgrown that could get anyone lost if they weren't careful enough. And those are exactly the type of places that she planned to search. The night was silent, calm with hardly a wind-disturbing snow-laden pines. Piled drifts reflected the moon, half waning, making Ula's mind wander away against her will, back to those nights, waiting, coughing, wondering when Aaron would be back with... She inhaled sharply, filling her lungs with icy dryness. She would not get distracted. She would find out what happened, where her husband disappeared to. Some told her that he abandoned her, or that perhaps a terrible beast got to him. She had to find out for herself. Approaching the edge of the area she knew the townsfolk previously scoured, Ula stared down the surrounding mountainous region. Trackers wouldn't have gone far up to them, because there was no reason he would go there. There was also not much reasoning as to check the side opposite, since it was known for packs of wild dogs and pockets of treacherous, false snow, in which mineral-rich layers of soil froze a white similar to regular snow, but were brittle and prone to making small sinkholes when disturbed. Tonight, she would start with the mountains. Going further than any before, trees passed through Ula's vision with careful scrutiny. There was much the bark of a tree can tell. How rich the soil is, what animals' territory expanded to, and any disputes they were going through. Which side was north and which might portend water. Rising over cracking boulders betwixt rising spires of churned earth, Ula found such evidence. She was near a river, perhaps a pond. Something she could use as a landmark to expand the search area. Pushing through a last bit of dense fallen forest, a wondrous sight befell her. It wasn't a pond she found, but a lake. One that she'd never visited before. It might have been marked on a map, but she couldn't be sure. Wide and fringed with lush and heavy evergreens, the water was perfectly frozen over, reflecting the moonlight with an intensity that made it shine almost brighter than the moon itself. This would be a perfect place to search. Ula was already making her plans to search the end of the lake before slowly making her way further out. It was far too massive to search in one night, even with a full team of trackers and hounds. She would come back in as many nights as it would take. Something caught Ula's attention. Not a wind, not the growl of an animal. Maybe a gentle crack of shore ice. Not taking any chances, she took hold of the axe at her side. Her eyes scanned the snow-riddled shrubs and winding network of trees perfectly straight, fallen, or askew. It came again. Stronger. Clearer. An echoey kind of giggle that brought forth the memories of stories she heard about whale song. Beautiful echoes that could reverberate across miles of water, contorted messages of a peaceful species. But the voice of whales could never reach this far inland, and Ula could not see what was making the noise. It sounded distant, but sometimes it would come from different angles. She'd heard of all sorts of myths since she was a kid. Everything from ghosts haunting dead woods of the north to sprightly snow foxes sprouting wings and flying away from astonished hunters. As she grew older, the myths stayed in Ula's mind, but they lost the magic to them. Just as it came, the echo left, leaving stale winter air in its wake. Ula stowed her axe, but kept a hand on it as she trudged along. She wouldn't be caught off guard by vengeful banshees or flying vulpin while she searched. And searched she did. Well into the night, until snow fell and a gray fog followed. Hardly getting a fraction of the lake covered, Ula resigned to coming back a different night. It would do her no good to be dead, although, sometimes, the grim thought of it crossed her mind. Days passed in much the same manner. Ula would work in the quarry on the days she was scheduled, then go out onto the lake to continue her exploration. Riel occasionally convinced her to go to lunch, and sometimes stay behind before leaving just long enough to have a light supper. While not oblivious to Riel's concerns, Ula tried her best to keep her friend out of it. She would be fine once she had closure. This might not be the best way to get it, but it was the only way that she wanted to get it. For days during her expeditions, Ula never heard the giggling echo. She was in the presence of a grand ice crack in the lake, a swarm of northern migratory birds sailing through, and even chased off a young stray wolf. But she never heard the strange sound again, until on her 10th day, it came. It was becoming too much to walk all the way back each night, so Ula was setting up a tent. Having the next few days off and warning Riel ahead of time, she would make as much progress as she could. The sound, nearly as faint as last time, reverberated through the trees around her. Who's there? The trees remained silent. Wind whistled somberly across frozen water. I don't have much to steal, if that's what you're after. You can convince me to share some jerky, but that's about it. She saw a flicker of light briefly pop out of a tree. Moments later, it came again, a bit longer this time. A gleam similar to reflections off pristine ice. A small head with two piercing green eyes leaned out from behind a crooked pine. Icy spikes lined the top of its head with a hint of color hiding beneath its surface. Ula simply stared, her grip loosened from her tool. They locked eyes for a minute. Then, with a little jump, followed by a raucous giggle, the thing dipped behind the tree. Wait! Ula's feet slipped on the snow, but she steadied herself and chased after the creature. Only catching glimpses of it, Ula found keeping up with whatever this thing was a challenge in itself. Seemingly popping up in the most random of places, up a tree, behind a rock, then a different rock, erupting from a snowdrift, the creature eluded her entirely, but she did piece together what it looked like. A small thing, only about 3 feet tall, made entirely of ice. Its eyes had a most unusual glow to them. One she knew she had seen before, but couldn't quite remember where. All around the lake bed she gave chase, ducking underneath fallen trees, diving over rocks into snow piles, all just to keep pace. The entire time putting up with the sing-song wispiness of laughter. It was the hardest Ula's heart had to beat in a long time. Her blood ran faster than when she was working in the quarry. They went through a dense forest, zigzagged their way around the lake, and just when Ula thought she'd cornered the little thing, it dove into the frozen water. Ice parted in front of it before instantly refreezing. Resting her hands on her knees, she breathed in frigid air, burning her lungs with a harsh chill. She waited to see if it would come back out, or at the very least give off another etheric giggle. The lake remained still, silent in the night. Ula's heart calmed, her blood slowed, leaving her with a lightened feeling. Lighter than she'd felt in a while. Getting her bearings, she made a mental note where the spirit disappeared before trudging back toward camp. The chilling wind felt not as unforgiving as before. Wait, you're serious? You're saying some kind of spirit formed from ice had you chase it around the mysterious lake in the middle of the night? Riel stopped eating her salad to hear her friend's tale. She was happy that Ula was more talkative since the incident nearly a year prior, but after listening to her retelling, Riel wasn't sure if she should be more concerned than before. Ula took another bite of steak, continuing to talk whilst chewing. I'm deadly serious. Don't look at me like that. People tell stranger stories around here. Hell, yesterday I overheard somebody in the quarry go on about granite lice crawling up their pant leg. Did some? Did some what? Did some granite lice crawl up their pant leg? Granite lice don't exist, Riel. Then help me believe this frozen spirit does. Riel slumped back in her chair, hands idly running through the fur collar of her coat. It's just... It scares me to think I'm losing my friend in more ways than one. I know I can't stop you from going out or chasing that thing, be it real or not, but I just want you to get better. Well, do you know what it could be? Any old legend or fireside story come to mind? Riel chewed on that question while Ula took another bite. Minutes passed with silence between the two. Patrons left and were replaced with new, hungrier customers, always somehow louder than those before them. Finally, a thought came to Riel. Doesn't that lady at the library tell a lot of children's stories? L'Orange, I think? Ula did know that name. L'Orange has been the town's favorite storyteller and librarian since she was a kid. She even visited a handful of times before with... Guess it's worth a shot, Ula sputtered. Know when she's available? Riel scoffed, a smile spreading on her lips. What am I, her secretary? Haven't a clue, but what else does a librarian have to do on a snowy midday? Good point. Ula finished chewing when she noticed Riel still smiling. What? She asked. Nothing. Well, it's just good to see you eat. Ula noticed that she finished her entire plate. It's been months since she's finished a whole meal. I was just hungry, okay? Well, off to see a librarian. Ula paid for her meal and exchanged goodbyes, then headed off for the library. Relatively small, all things considered, but there was something especially serene about the slanted, all-wooden building surrounded on both sides by humble homes. Wandering traders and caravans were scarce this far north, so any that wandered by were a treat, and those selling books more so. Stepping over the threshold, Ula left the cheery midday for that of lantern light reflected off tinted glass, placed in such a way that every cozy spot and aisle of shelved books had at least a reading level of light. No one was at the front desk, but it didn't take long for her to find the librarian on duty. L'Orange was a kindly old lady. Her nearly pure white hair cascaded on either side of her collarbone, and she wore a dress that was in fashion 2 generations ago. She hummed to herself as she rearranged some books, barely glancing over at Ula. What can I do for you, dear? She asked. Ula shot a glance at the selection of books on the aisle, so astonishingly robust compared to the size of the building. Just seeing if I can find a book or two. Well, far from me to be so curt, but you hardly seem a bookworm. Nevertheless, I find it's the ones who don't seem that type that prod the more interesting questions. What are you looking for? Have you any books on mythological creatures? Ula asked. Oh, you'll have to be more specific. We've got all kinds of compendiums regarding the supernatural. How about ice spirits? L'Orange shelved a final book, then paused in thought. She turned to look at Ula now, eyes awash with curiosity. Interesting. Most people asking for books on legends want them for scary stories or wild speculative prospects. Skin snatchers, malevolent sprites, and so on. What made you take interest in ice spirits? Ula frowned. A friend said she saw one. Dead set on it. We're having a debate, and I want to know if she might have actually seen one. L'Orange gave Ula a soft smile. We do have a book or two on them, but I'll do you one better. Story time is within the hour. How about I make you some tea while you wait for the crowd to come? Should be quite a turnout today. The librarian moved quickly for her age, already leading Ula to a sitting area and fetching a tea tray before she could argue that she just wanted the book. A few minutes later, L'Orange poured some tea and tended to some other duties while Ula waited. She had to admit, waiting here with a warm cup of tea brought back mildly pleasant memories when her parents brought her here as a kid. Minutes passed, and the light outside slowly dimmed while more and more people showed up. Parents socialized while their little ones snuck around the library playing tag or skimming through easy-to-reach books. Ula's heart clenched, seeing so many wild, rakshas young spirits running about. If things had happened differently... Before her mind could drag her down, everyone shuffled toward the largest reading room in the library. Large being a generous term. All in all 16 children could sit cross-legged on the shaggy fur rug, while adults either separated into their own cliques in different parts of the building, or stood around to listen in. Ula stayed in the outer ring of bodies, briefly imagining her younger self eagerly scrambling to get a seat in front of the storyteller's feet. L'Orange gingerly stepped around the kids, introducing herself with a large smile and a big, colorful book clasped in her hands. The kids were eager, but finally simmered down and stayed quiet as the librarian cracked open the children's tale. It was one that Ula vaguely remembered from her childhood, The Rabbit and the Raven. A story about a clever rabbit who convinced a raven to bring them food to last through the winter. a tall tale filled with guile and finding friendship in unusual places. L'Orange clearly loved her spot in this small community, truly devoted to her title as storyteller. And they parted ways, sure that they would see each other again one day. The end. The children clapped as she closed the book. L'Orange bowed her head a few times. Thank you, thank you. Setting the book aside, she leaned forward, looking each of the kids in the eyes. Do you all want to hear a special story next? The young ones eagerly agreed and simmered back down. This one is from when I was a little tyke, just like all of you. My Mima would tell stories of spookums and sprites that roam our fair, uncertain land. But one above all stood out, and she would tell it thus. Our land is now barrenless, but once there were lords and ladies that ruled the land long ago. This was a time where our world was filled with wonder, and these whims of fate trickled into our lakes, ponds, and streams. Before there were creatures of the night, there were creatures of light, known as spirits. Bundles of joy and goodness that chased away all the things that makes hearts heavy. Wily and not so easily caught, spirits only showed themselves to those who needed their aid the most. Lost souls strayed from their path, or those that lost a great deal. L'Orange's face softened, almost like she was remembering a time when one of these spirits revealed themselves to her. You see, she continued, all spirits have a purpose, given to them by the light that created them, the light from our own skies in our long winter nights. She paused tactically, waiting for a hand to be raised. One did, followed immediately by a question. What happened to them? If they were so good, why did they go away? L'Orange raised a finger. Ah, that is a good question, maybe. Eventually you will learn that in our world, not everything is so noble as a spirit, and not every stranger has the best intentions for their neighbors. There were those who abused the kindness of the spirits. They would trick them, trap them in lanterns, and torment them into giving up their secrets of light. Cruel, cruel men who would later become known as warlocks. It would be they who created the first monsters of the night that roamed the forests, and by doing so turned the spirit's light a despoiled color. The spirits knew that they could not hide forever from these men, and so they decided to retreat back to the land of their origins. L'Orange gestured above her, the ceiling of the reading room painted long ago to resemble the night sky filled with the lights. A colorful phenomenon this far north, where the inky fabric of space tore and light from the stars flowed like a river across the sky. Fleeing our realm, they assured that no twisted soul could gain access to their secrets ever again. Leaning forward, she whispered, But while the time of their spreading joy is long over, some say that they still come down to visit us on occasion, roaming the woods in the night, searching for souls in need of healing. All they need be given is a vessel to hold their kindness. L'Orange sat back while the kids clapped and was immediately flooded with as many questions as a dozen plus kids could muster in a single breath. Ula did her best to tune them out and chewed on the story. She still wasn't sure if what she saw was one of these spirits, or what it was trying to do by having her chase it around the forest, but it was better than nothing. Parents gathered their kids, releasing L'Orange from her prison of a million questions. They thanked her and bundled up their children for the walks back home through the growing night. Though she seemed lively, there was a bit of sadness in the librarian's mood as she watched everyone dissipate, once more leaving the library silent and empty. L'Orange scooted past Ula, scouring a low bookshelf. I hope you had fun, my dear. Seemed like the kids enjoyed it, Ula replied. L'Orange smiled. Always better to leave your audience enlightened than dreary. Besides, it was a special occasion. Ula turned to the librarian. But do you actually, believe it? Believe what, my dear? Your grandmother's story about the spirits? L'Orange came back up with a small tome in hand and handed it off to Ula. Covered in dust, the cover portrayed a little wisp of light surrounded by trees and ice. My dear Ula, that's the best part about believing. It's not the minds of others you need to convince, only your heart that needs to feel it. For the next several weeks, Ula took more days away from the quarry and spent more time out searching. Whether it was a feeling in her gut or the occasional visits from the same giggling icicle, she felt she was close to the truth, pouring every ounce of effort into her mission. The reclusive spirit didn't show up every day, and only ever at night, but their visits became more and more frequent, staying for longer and longer. It would always want something to do with Ula, no matter her activity. Pitching camp? Sudden snowball fight. Setting up marker stakes so she didn't get lost? Nope. Time to play tag. While the spirit's antics got more and more annoying, Ula found herself welcoming the energy into her routine. It also gave her plenty of time to see it more clearly. While she was cooking or writing notes on her map, the spirit would dangle from frozen tree limbs or climb hollow logs. The ice that made up its body was incredibly clear, but Ula couldn't see all the way through. A fog seemed to roll around its insides, accompanied by flickers of luminescence. Teal, turquoise, sapphire, purple, colors reminiscent of the lights. Ula's time spent away from the lake, the spirit, her search, grew tiring. She found herself wanting more than living. Toil in the quarry felt dull in comparison to watching the spirit bound around the treetops. She would rather watch it swim in frozen waters with baby seals than research about it in a library. L'Orange was always nice when she visited and asked her more questions about her time spent abroad. Ula never told her of her personal experiences at the lake, and soon the librarian stopped asking questions altogether. She still recommended books for her. Riel noticed the changes as well. Ula would eat more, talk more, do more, but something was different. She had no idea what Ula was doing on her expeditions. All she could do was be a good friend. "You look better," she said one time at a late lunch. A snowstorm was said to roll through, and Pierre let the laborers go early so they could prepare. Ula still planned to go out. "I don't feel better." Well, I guess that's not entirely true. Everything feels different when I'm here. Like I'm stuck. Stuck in that... Ula cut herself off. Suddenly, her breads and cheeses looked unappetizing, leaving a dry taste in her mouth. Riel leaned forward, taking Ula's hands. "You're doing fine. It's hard to move on. Harder than anything I've ever had to do in my life. I don't know what's changed with you recently, but it seems to be helping you heal. And anything I can do to help, I will do it. I promise." For the first time in a long time, Ula took some comfort in her friend's words. They did make her realize that her issues were not something that her friend could truly help with. "Thank you, Riel." Ula trudged along, finishing her meal and chatting with her best friend. After paying, they said their goodbyes and parted ways. Ula didn't realize it would be the last time she would see her childhood friend. That night, Ula braved the storm. Those who grew up in Bjelholm knew how to handle the hinterland's harsh whims. What to wear, what to pack, and where to look for brief respite. Taking her twice as long to reach her base camp, Ula settled down into a familiar routine. Although there would be no fire tonight, she felt warm enough under her layered furs. Strangely enough, the spirit wasn't there. It usually waited for her now, but tonight must be different. Saddened, but undeterred, Ula gathered her strength and headed out to one of the last areas surrounding the lake that she needed to check. The storm raged, but the surrounding mountains and trees blocked enough of the wind to almost make it calming. A diminished howl still echoed in a distant lull as she came across a frozen stream leaking off the lake. Ula's heart skipped a beat. Not because she saw the spirit solemnly staring up at a tippling trunk, but what the spirit was looking at. A wooden spike with a metal tip driven deep into the bark. A single strip of green cloth tied to one end, fluttering in the wind like an omen from the past. Stumbling through the snow, Ula ripped the tracking spike out from the tree, holding it close to her chest. "It's Aaron's," she barely whispered above the gale. "His favorite color. We used it when..." The spirit tugged on her cloak, sending a clear chill through all the layers of warmth. It looked sad to see Ula so distraught. Looking between her and the tracking spike, its eyes lit up. Darting across the snow without leaving so much as a tiny footprint, it moved along the shallow brook, stopping a length ahead to wave Ula forward. Ula stood. Shaky, determined, she trudged through this fresh powdery snow. Following the spirit along the stream, she came across another tracking spike, this one with a green ribbon as well. Leaving this one lodged, she continued down a gentle slope through the woods, following a trail long cold and where it would surely lead to disappointment. The spirit kept going forward, darting in and out of sight until Ula thought she lost it. She called out, telling it to wait. Then she left the trees. A pond, glistening, clear, and unfrozen, lay before her, surrounded by an expanse spotted with firs, pines, and the beginnings of mountainous ridges. The snow stopped. Wind halted. A sky filled with stars soared overhead while a small icy form splashed about in the water. Ula moved up to the edge of the pond. It looked lifeless. Not a fish or plant in sight. But something about it made her want to look closer. Taking one small step, then another, she bent down and removed a glove to prod the water. A remarkably strong chill surged through her finger, an intensity that couldn't merely be caused by its temperature. She stumbled back, kicking up a flurry of snow. Her heart quickened, her body shivered madly to keep warm. Alarmed, the spirit swam to shore and approached Ula with hands raised, a sad shade of green welling up in its eyes. Ula recoiled, not wanting to feel the striking chill. "No, I don't want to do whatever this is," she said through chattering teeth. The spirit's body shivered. A shimmer of dull blue streamed through them, and they sulked back into the pond. Their head jerked up toward the mountains, where waves of color began to roll off. Across the black, star-dotted fabric coursed etheric hues of the lights. Primordial greens dancing with brilliant blues in a waltz that only they could perform. Ula watched in silence with the spirit, her eyes filled with the ever-growing river of colors, sending her mind reeling back to those long winter nights with Aaron. They both loved the lights. It was on a night like this that they started courting. A night like this when Eric was born. Nights like this were always enough to make her worries feel manageable. Her thoughts were interrupted as the spirit waved to her. It gestured with a hopeful expression on its smooth, mouthless face of cloudy ice. Ula reflected about last year. How out of tune she felt. How numb everything was, even when she worked in the quarry. Every tinge of pain, jarred shock of pick against stone, gave her something to feel. But each strike also drove her deeper into her twisted recluse. She then thought about the last couple weeks. Her weeks of searching for closure in rime-coated woods. Weeks of cold, dreary work. Weeks of chasing down the spirit through shin-high snow and dealing with the occasional snowball thrown her way, or how they would accidentally stuff out the fire when they got too close, and how they would almost cry. Nights spent watching it drift off into slumber as she planned the next part of her search. Tentatively, Ula stood. Renewed vigor filled her steps leading up to the water's edge. If all the snow were melted in late spring weather, she would have seen the frozen body of a man, arms outstretched as if to place something into the pond. Ula stepped into the water. A dreadfully cold itch surged up her leg, instantly numbing her senses. She pressed on, submerging her other leg. Moving forward, the water enveloped her with a numbing embrace. The lights glowed brighter. To Ula, they appeared to split from the main river to trickle down into the pond, enveloping her eyes, her body, and something else in a way that she couldn't quite describe. Her waist disappeared into the water, then her hands, torso, neck, and finally her head. She didn't float. Instead, she was able to walk on through the crystalline waters, now fully intermingled with the lights, With each step, Ula could feel more. She sensed her layers of furs and cloth leaving her. She felt light, nimble, unburdened. Everything began to brighten. Her sight widened, tinted with those wonderful hues of blue and green, ringed with hints of purple and white. She rose in the water, drifting to the surface, born anew. Ula's head broke the surface. She felt her face with new, alien senses through frozen light. The lights surged overhead in the night with an air that didn't seem so uncaring anymore. The spirit cheered, jumping across the disturbed pond to wrap Ula in a hug. Ula found she didn't feel cold from his touch. Whirling around, she splashed and laughed and enveloped the spirit in her new arms. The spirit nestled its head into Ula's chest, and she cradled him with all the love that she missed. In her chest, something beat brighter than her tortured heart could ever muster, and Ula felt warmer than she had in months.